Grace Martin stood in the cramped dressing room of St. Luke's Chapel, staring at the mirror as if it could answer the storm of questions in her mind. The lace on her borrowed wedding gown shimmered faintly under the yellow light, each bead carefully sewn by her Aunt Martha just the night before. She smoothed her palms down the skirt, trying to calm the tremble in her hands. From the hallway came her aunt's voice, warm but edged with urgency. "Grace, dear, the guests are all seated. The choir's about to start the processional. Are you ready?" Grace took a deep breath, forced her lips into a smile, and said, "Yes, I'm ready," though her heart was thudding so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. Today was supposed to be perfect, her day, her moment, the one where she walked toward Liam, the man she believed was her forever. He had a way of making her feel seen, loved, like no one else mattered in the room. She remembered their first meeting at a friend's birthday party, the easy laughter, the way he held her hand like it was something fragile. Now, all that was left was for him to walk through the church doors. She glanced at the clock, 11:05 a.m. The wedding was scheduled for 11 sharp. He was probably on his way. Liam had always been a last-minute person, sometimes frustratingly so, but never unreliable. Her cousin Beezy, radiant in a lemon-yellow bridesmaid gown, stepped inside, eyes shifting uneasily. "Grace, he's not here yet." Grace forced a small laugh. "He's probably stuck in traffic. You know how these roads are." But Beezy's expression didn't soften. "I've been calling him since 9. His phone's off." Grace blinked. Maybe his battery died. He'll be here. Yet, by 11:20, the hum from the chapel had shifted. The polite chatter was turning into whispers laced with curiosity. Grace peeked through the side door. The benches were full, neighbors, old schoolmates, her parents in the front row. Her father leaned toward the pastor, speaking in low tones. Her mother kept adjusting the lace on her head wrap, her gaze darting to the entrance every few seconds. Another 10 minutes passed, each one stretching painfully. Grace's phone felt heavy in her hand as she tried Liam's number. Straight to voicemail. Again. Nothing. Beezy began pacing. "Grace, this isn't just a small delay. Something's wrong." Grace swallowed hard. He wouldn't just disappear. At 11:50, the pastor stepped into the room, his face carefully neutral. "Grace, I've spoken with the best man. He hasn't heard from Liam since last night." Grace frowned. "That's impossible. He texted me around midnight, said he loved me and couldn't wait for today." The pastor nodded, his tone gentle. "Perhaps something urgent came up. Do you want to wait a bit longer?" "Yes, of course," she said quickly. Noon came, then 12:30. Guests shifted in their seats. Some fanned themselves, others whispered behind hands. Liam's cousin stood and left, muttering about shame. Grace's mother approached. "Grace, maybe we should." "No." The word burst out sharper than intended. Then quieter, "No. Please, just give him more time." Her aunt offered her a glass of water she couldn't bring herself to drink. Her veil began to feel like it weighed a ton. Every attempt to call Liam ended in the same hollow voicemail. Then, at 1:15, the pastor stepped out to address the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems there has been an unforeseen delay. The ceremony will not be proceeding today." The words crashed over Grace like a wave. She stood frozen as chairs scraped, shoes clicked on the chapel floor, and people began filing out, some with pity in their eyes, others with disapproval. Back in the dressing room, Grace tore off her veil, pins scattering to the floor. Beezy crouched to gather them, whispering, "Maybe something happened to him." Grace's voice was low, bitter. "If something happened, I'd have heard by now. He left, Beezy. He just left." Her mother entered with her father close behind. "Come home with us," she urged. Grace shook her head. "I need to think." She gathered her small suitcase, her phone, and the lace shawl her mother had given her that morning. By evening, the chapel was silent, sunlight spilling through the stained glass windows. She stepped outside into the cooling air and began walking. Her heels clicked on the road until the skin of her feet burned. She slipped them off and carried them, dust clinging to the hem of her gown. The road stretched ahead, lined with tall grass whispering in the wind, and she walked without looking back, each step carrying her farther from the life she thought she was stepping into that morning. Grace reached the edge of town just as the street lamps flickered to life, their glow cutting weakly through the gathering dusk. The air had cooled, but her thoughts still burned with the heat of humiliation. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if her dress itself had absorbed the weight of the day. People were still out, shopkeepers closing up, children playing in the distance, but she kept her gaze forward, unwilling to meet curious eyes. She knew word of the aborted wedding would already be spreading like wildfire through the small community. In towns like this, gossip didn't just travel fast, it lived for moments like hers. She imagined Mrs. Eves from the bakery, standing behind the counter tomorrow morning, flour-dusted hands gesturing dramatically as she whispered to customers about poor Grace, left at the altar like that. She imagined her former classmates smirking into their phones as they typed messages in group chats, recalling the times they had said Liam seemed too smooth to be true. Every scenario felt like another needle pressing into her skin. Her phone buzzed in her hand and she froze, a wild hope springing up despite everything. It was a message from Beezy. "Are you okay? Where are you?" Grace stared at the screen for a moment before typing. "Just walking. Need air." She didn't trust herself to say more. Any detail would only make the ache sharper. She considered calling her parents, but could already hear her father's tone. Firm, practical, heavy with unspoken "I told you so." And she couldn't bear it yet. She turned down a quieter street, lined with shuttered shops. Her feet were sore, but she kept moving, drawn forward by a stubborn refusal to stop and feel the full force of the day. The memory of Liam's last text to her the night before replayed in her mind. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Love you." So casual, so certain. No sign of the storm that would hit just hours later. She remembered reading it while curled up in bed, smiling into the darkness, picturing his face at the altar. Now she wondered if that message had been a lie typed with an easy grin before he turned to whatever life he'd chosen instead. The quiet was broken by the rumble of an approaching motorcycle. She stepped aside as it passed, the rider glancing at her with open curiosity. She must have looked strange barefoot in a wedding gown, carrying shoes in one hand and a small suitcase in the other. She imagined how that image would stick in someone's mind, ready to be repeated over drinks at a bar or over bowls of pepper soup. I saw her myself, walking like a ghost through the streets. Eventually she reached the door to her small apartment block. The building loomed in the dim light, its faded yellow paint peeling in long strips. She climbed the stairs slowly, dragging her suitcase behind her. Inside her flat, the stillness was suffocating. The wedding preparations had left it in chaos, makeup brushes scattered across the coffee table, garment bags hanging on the back of chairs, the faint scent of the perfume she'd planned to wear all evening lingering in the air. She set down her suitcase and collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. It was only then, in the privacy of her empty home, that the tears came. They weren't delicate movie scene tears. They were raw, shaking sobs that left her throat sore. She thought about the life she'd been ready to start that morning, the one she had imagined so vividly it felt real. The house Liam had promised they'd find together, the trips they had talked about taking, the children they had joked about naming after favorite relatives. It had all dissolved into nothing in the span of a few hours. After a while, the crying slowed. Grace sat up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She needed water. She went into the kitchen, but the sight of the untouched wedding cake sample on the counter made her stomach turn. She grabbed a glass of water and sipped slowly, forcing her mind to focus on something simple. That was when she noticed the envelope on the floor, half hidden under the door. She bent down and picked it up. There was no name, no return address, just her name scrawled in black ink. She tore it open, her fingers stiff. Inside was a single piece of paper with 5 words written in bold block letters. "Don't look for him." Her heart thudded. This wasn't Liam's handwriting. She turned the paper over, looking for any clue, but it was blank. The message was as clear as it was unsettling. Someone knew where Liam was, or at least knew why he wasn't here, and they didn't want her finding out. She felt the urge to show it to someone, but who? Her parents would demand answers she didn't have. The police? What would she even say? "My fiancé left me at the altar, and someone left me a vague warning note. They'd probably chalk it up to a cruel prank. She set the note on the counter and forced herself to change out of the gown. The zipper stuck halfway, and she had to twist awkwardly to pull it down. Once free of the heavy fabric, she slipped into loose cotton trousers and a t-shirt. The relief of comfort was immediate, but it did nothing to quiet the turmoil in her chest. She gathered the gown into its garment bag and shoved it into the back of her wardrobe. Out of sight, but not out of mind. That night, sleep was impossible. Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation she'd had with Liam in the past month, looking for cracks she'd missed. There had been moments, small ones, when he seemed distracted, when his phone calls ran long and his answers to her questions were short. She had chalked it up to work stress. He'd said he was dealing with a big project. Now she wondered if that had been the start of his disappearing act. Sometime around 3 a.m., exhaustion won out, but her dreams were restless and full of voices she couldn't place. Morning brought no clarity. Her phone had blown up with messages, busy again, her mother, a couple of close friends, and several numbers she didn't recognize. The unread count was a wall she didn't feel ready to climb. She ignored them, choosing instead to shower and try to start the day. But starting the day without a plan felt like pushing against a locked door. Her job at the community library had given her the week off for the honeymoon, so there was nowhere she needed to be. That might have been a blessing, but in this moment it only gave her more space to think. By late morning, hunger forced her out. She walked to the small market nearby, wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. She could feel eyes on her as she moved between stalls, imagined the vendors' polite smiles hiding whispers. At the vegetable stand, Mrs. Lawal leaned in slightly and said, "My dear, I'm so sorry about yesterday." Grace forced a smile and thanked her, but inside she felt an old instinct kicking in, keeping her real emotions locked away to avoid giving anyone more to talk about. She returned home with a small bag of food and tried to eat, but every bite felt like chewing paper. Her mind kept drifting back to the note, the bold, impersonal handwriting, the deliberate lack of explanation, the warning. She couldn't decide if it was meant to scare her, protect her, or both. In the afternoon, she sat by the window with a notebook, jotting down every possibility she could think of. Each one was more unsettling than the last. Maybe Liam owed money to someone dangerous. Maybe he was hiding from something in his past. Maybe he was never who he said he was at all. By evening, she still had no answers. The apartment felt smaller by the hour, its walls pressing in. She decided to walk again, this time heading toward the outskirts of town. The streets grew quieter the farther she went, the buildings giving way to stretches of open land. She didn't have a destination, only the need to move. The air was heavy with the smell of impending rain, and the sky hung low and gray. It was along that stretch of empty road that she began to truly feel the isolation settling in. Here she was, a day removed from the altar, no fiancé, no explanation, no plan. All she had was a suitcase half-packed for a trip that would never happen, and a note that felt like a warning from a world she didn't understand. She walked until her legs ached, until the first drops of rain started to fall, cold and sharp against her skin. She turned back, her pace quickening as the drizzle grew into a steady shower. By the time she reached her street, her hair was plastered to her head, and her clothes clung damply to her frame. Inside, she toweled off and wrapped herself in a blanket on the couch. The rain outside became a downpour, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. She found herself staring at the note again. "Don't look for him." The words seemed heavier now, as if they were settling into her bones. She didn't know if she could obey them, but for tonight, she decided she would. Tonight she would let the storm outside cover the one still raging inside her, and tomorrow she would decide whether she wanted the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. The next morning came gray and damp, the air still heavy with the smell of last night's rain. Grace woke with the blanket wrapped around her like a shield, her body stiff from sleeping on the couch. She sat up slowly, the events of the past 2 days returning to her with the weight of a stone dropped into deep water. There was no moment of confusion, no fragile space between sleep and wakefulness where she could pretend everything was fine. The note was still on the coffee table, its blunt message staring at her like an accusation. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The handwriting was too sharp, too intentional, as if the person had been determined not to be recognized. She set it down again and moved to the kitchen. Breakfast felt like a task she should do rather than something she wanted. So she made tea and forced herself to eat 2 slices of bread. Every swallow was dry. She thought about calling her mother, but the thought of her voice, heavy with sympathy and questions Grace couldn't answer, made her push the phone away. She couldn't handle the pity or the reminders that she'd been left behind. By mid-morning, the walls felt too close again. She showered, dressed in a faded pair of jeans and a long-sleeved shirt, pulled her hair into a bun, and slipped uncomfortable shoes. She packed a bottle of water and her wallet into her small handbag. The streets were quieter than usual, the damp keeping most people indoors, but she didn't mind. She headed away from the market this time, moving toward the old road that led out of town. The houses here grew sparser, the pavements cracked and uneven. Puddles glistened in the sunlight, breaking timidly through the clouds. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth. Each step felt like she was pushing herself into unfamiliar territory, but that was the point. She wanted to be somewhere her thoughts couldn't follow so easily. The sound of her own footsteps on the road became a kind of rhythm. Her mind wandered in and out of the past. She saw Liam smile in her mind's eye, the way he'd lean against a doorway with his arms crossed, watching her talk. She remembered the night he'd asked her to marry him, how he'd seemed almost boyish in his excitement. And yet, she couldn't ignore the other memories creeping in. The abrupt changes in his schedule, the way he'd dodge questions with a quick joke, the moments she thought she saw shadows in his expression when he thought she wasn't looking. She pushed the thoughts away and kept walking. After an hour, the buildings had given way to stretches of open land, tall grass swaying in the breeze. The hum of insects filled the air. She stopped for a sip of water and checked her phone. No new messages. A strange kind of relief washed over her. At least no one was chasing her with questions she couldn't answer. She kept walking, not thinking about where she was going, only that she didn't want to stop yet. That was when she heard the low rumble of an engine behind her. She stepped to the side of the road, expecting another motorbike, but instead a faded blue pickup truck rolled into view. It slowed as it came up beside her, the engine idling low. The driver leaned slightly toward the open window. He was a man in his 30s, dark-skinned, clean-shaven, with eyes that seemed to observe everything in a single glance. His hair was cropped short, and he wore a simple gray t-shirt. "You look like you've been walking a while," he said, his voice deep but even. Grace adjusted her grip on her bag. "I'm fine," she replied, keeping her tone polite but guarded. His eyes flicked briefly to her shoes, then back to her face. "Where you headed?" She hesitated. "Just away from town for a bit." He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "I'm heading out past the highway. I can give you a ride if you want. It's not a safe road to walk alone, especially this time of year." Grace's first instinct was to say no. Her father's voice from childhood echoed in her mind, warning about strangers. But her legs ached. The sun was warming into an uncomfortable glare, and she was too far from home to easily turn back. "I don't know you," she said, though her voice softened slightly. "Daniel," he said simply. "Daniel Cole." He didn't add anything else, didn't push her, just waited with that same steady gaze. Something in his manner, the absence of urgency, the calmness, made her feel he wasn't a threat. She looked at the road ahead, then back at him. "All right," she said quietly. He reached across and opened the passenger door. She climbed in, the worn leather seat creaking beneath her, and shut the door. The truck smelled faintly of motor oil and something earthy, like fresh-cut wood. The dashboard was clean but scratched in places, the marks of long use. Daniel shifted into gear, and they began to move, the truck rumbling steadily along the road. They drove in silence for the first few minutes. Grace kept her gaze on the passing fields, watching the way the sunlight dappled through the trees in the distance. She could feel Daniel glance at her once or twice, but he didn't speak until they were a few kilometers down the road. "You from around here?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Born and raised." "Small towns," he said with a faint smile. "Everyone knows everyone." She nodded but didn't answer, unsure how much she wanted to reveal. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he added, as if reading her thoughts. Sometimes people just need a ride without questions. That, oddly, made her want to say more. "Yesterday was supposed to be my wedding day," she said before she could stop herself. She could feel his eyes flick toward her again, though his expression didn't change much. "And it didn't happen," he said quietly, not as a question but as a statement. "No," she replied, "it didn't." He didn't offer platitudes or tell her it was going to be okay. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a truth that didn't need to be dressed up in comfort. They passed a stretch of road where the grass grew wild on either side, dotted with small white flowers. Daniel slowed the truck slightly for a pothole, then glanced at her again. "You want me to take you somewhere specific?" She shook her head. "I don't even know where I'm going." "Then we'll figure that out as we go," he said. The simplicity of the statement eased something in her chest. For the first time in 2 days, she felt like she could take a breath without it catching in her throat. They drove for nearly an hour, the landscape shifting from open fields to rolling hills. Daniel didn't pry, but he also didn't ignore her presence. He pointed out a group of birds perched on a fence, mentioned a small farm he sometimes stopped at for fresh eggs. There was a steadiness to him, a groundedness that contrasted sharply with the chaos still swirling in her own life. When they finally reached a junction where the road split, he glanced at her. "I have a place not far from here. It's quiet. You can rest there if you want before you decide what's next." She hesitated, weighing the risk against the exhaustion tugging at her. "I can't pay you," she said. "Didn't ask you to," he replied, and for reasons she didn't fully understand. She nodded. "All right." The truck turned onto a narrower road, lined with trees whose branches arched overhead. The shade was cool and dappled, the air smelling faintly of pine and damp soil. After another 10 minutes, they pulled into a gravel driveway leading to a large, weathered building that looked like it had once been a countryside inn. Its walls were painted a soft cream, faded in places, and the wide porch held 2 old rocking chairs. Daniel parked and stepped out, coming around to open her door. "Come on," he said. "You can stay here a few nights until you figure things out." She followed him up the steps, her mind still turning over everything that had happened since she left the chapel. But for the first time, the weight on her shoulders felt just slightly lighter. The inn was quiet except for the faint creak of the porch boards beneath their feet and the soft sigh of the wind through the trees. Grace paused at the doorway, taking in the building's worn elegance. It had the look of a place that had once been lively. Families coming for weekend stays, travelers pausing between long journeys. But now it seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped inside, gesturing for her to follow. The air inside was cool and carried a faint scent of old wood and lavender, as though the building had absorbed decades of seasons and still remembered them. They stepped into a wide foyer with a polished wooden counter along one wall, the kind a receptionist might have stood behind. To the right was a sitting room with high-backed chairs arranged around a cold fireplace. Sunlight filtered in through lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the floor. "This place used to belong to my family," Daniel said as he set his keys down on the counter. "My parents ran it for years. After they passed, it stayed empty for a while. I've been working on fixing it up bit by bit." Grace trailed her fingers along the back of one of the chairs, feeling the smooth fabric. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was a kind of peace here that she hadn't felt in days. Daniel gave a short nod and motioned toward the staircase. "Come on, I'll show you a room." The steps groaned under their weight as they climbed to the second floor. The hallway stretched long, lined with doors on either side. He stopped at one near the middle and opened it, revealing a modest room with a double bed, a dresser, and a small writing desk by the window. The quilt on the bed was handmade, the kind with neat squares of mismatched fabric. "It's clean," Daniel said. "The bathroom's down the hall, shared, but you're the only one staying here right now, so it's yours." Grace stepped inside, her suitcase bumping lightly against her leg. She placed it near the dresser and stood for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around her. "Thank you," she said softly. For the ride, for this, he shrugged. It's no trouble. Everyone needs somewhere to land sometimes. His tone carried no judgment, no curiosity laced with gossip. Just a statement of fact. He left her to settle in, saying he'd be downstairs if she needed anything. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers absently tracing the quilt stitching. The events of the past 2 days replayed in fragments. Her reflection in the dressing room mirror, the whispers in the chapel, the empty road. And now here she was, in a stranger's, and that felt more like a safe harbor than any place she'd been since it happened. She unpacked slowly, hanging her spare clothes in the wardrobe, setting her toiletries in the small corner of the dresser. She hesitated before placing the envelope with the note inside the drawer. It felt wrong to keep it close, but she wasn't ready to throw it away either. When she finally went downstairs, she found Daniel in the kitchen, slicing bread. The kitchen was large, with wide counters and a window over the sink that looked out onto the back garden. "Hungry?" he asked without looking up. "A little," she admitted. He set out bread, butter, and a jar of what looked like homemade jam. "It's not much, but it's fresh. The bread came from the bakery in town this morning." She took a seat at the small table in the corner. "This place. It must be a lot of work to keep up," she said, watching him move with easy familiarity. "It is," he said, spreading butter on a slice. "But it's worth it. My parents poured everything they had into this place. I couldn't just let it fall apart." There was a quiet pride in his voice that made her wonder what it was like to feel that kind of connection to something lasting. She accepted the plate he offered and took a bite. The bread was warm, the jam sweet with just a hint of tartness. For a few moments, they ate in silence. After lunch, she wandered the ground floor. The sitting room's shelves were filled with books whose spines showed years of use. A wide dining room stood at the back, its long table covered with a dust cloth. The walls held photographs in black and white and faded color, smiling guests, holiday decorations. Daniel as a boy standing beside an older man who must have been his father. In one photo, a young woman with a kind smile stood at the reception counter. Grace paused before it. "Your mother?" she asked when Daniel appeared in the doorway. He nodded. She loved this place more than anyone. She said it was like welcoming the world to your doorstep. Grace studied the picture for another moment before moving on. By late afternoon, the light outside had softened into gold. Grace sat on the porch steps, watching it filter through the trees. She could hear Daniel somewhere behind the building, the faint clink of tools. She closed her eyes, letting the air settle around her. She hadn't realized until now how tense she'd been, how her shoulders had stayed tight since the wedding day. Here, for a moment, they loosened. She stayed like that until she heard footsteps on the porch. Daniel appeared, wiping his hands on a rag. "There's a storm coming later," he said, glancing at the horizon where clouds were beginning to gather. "Best to stay in tonight." She nodded. "I'm not planning to go anywhere." They spent the evening in the sitting room. Daniel lit a fire in the old fireplace, the flames sending a warm glow across the room. He brought out a pot of tea, and they sipped it in companionable silence. Grace found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, his calm posture, the way he seemed entirely comfortable and quiet. It was so different from Liam, who always filled silences with chatter or plans. She wondered what Daniel saw when he looked at her, a stranger passing through, a woman with a broken wedding behind her, or just another traveler needing shelter. Later, as she stood to head upstairs, she thanked him again. "You've done more for me than you needed to," she said. He met her eyes for a moment, something unreadable there, before he said, "Sometimes you help because you can. That's all." She went up to her room, feeling that strange, cautious sense of trust growing despite herself. In bed, listening to the wind picking up outside, she thought about the road ahead. She still didn't know what had happened to Liam, still didn't know if she even wanted to find out. But for the first time, she felt she might have the space to decide, without the noise of everyone else's voices in her ear. The storm came in the early hours, rain tapping against the window and wind rattling the shutters. Grace woke briefly, pulling the quilt tighter, then drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the world outside was washed clean, the air smelling fresh and sharp. She found Daniel in the kitchen again, frying eggs. Sleep well, he asked. Better than I have in days, she admitted. He nodded toward the table. Eat, then you can help me with something if you want. I need to bring in some firewood before the next rain. She agreed, surprised at herself. It felt good to be given something to do, to be part of the rhythm of this place, even just for a little while. As they worked outside, stacking logs under the porch roof, Grace caught herself glancing at Daniel. There was still a lot she didn't know about him. Why he lived here alone, why he'd been driving that road the day he found her. But for now, she didn't ask. Some answers, she told herself, could wait. And as the clouds began to gather again in the distance, she realized that for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she wasn't thinking about running. She was simply here, in this moment, and that was enough. Grace woke late the next morning, sunlight pressing through the lace curtains in a dappled pattern across the quilt. The steady rhythm of rain had faded into a gentle drip from the eaves outside, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth. For a moment she lay still, listening to the muted sounds of the inn settling into its morning. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint clink of dishes and the hum of a kettle. It was easy to imagine, if she let herself, that she was a traveler stopping briefly on her way somewhere else, that her arrival here hadn't been born out of something broken. She pushed the quilt aside and sat on the edge of the bed, letting her bare feet touch the cool wooden floor. Her suitcase sat in the corner where she had left it, still only half unpacked. She stood, stretching, and decided she would finish unpacking today. It wasn't that she planned to stay long, but part of her thought that maybe settling her things, even a little, might steady her mind. She pulled open the small wardrobe, arranging her folded clothes neatly on the shelves. The repetitive task gave her something to focus on that wasn't memory or speculation. She moved next to the dresser, opening each drawer to see what space she had. The top drawer was empty. The second held an extra set of linens. The third was a little stiff when she pulled, and inside she found an assortment of odds and ends clearly left from the inn's earlier years, an old pen, a stray button, a yellowing postcard with a picture of the coastline. She smiled faintly at the postcard, imagining a guest buying it as a souvenir and forgetting to send it. At the back of the drawer, her fingers brushed something firmer. She reached in and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was a photo album, the edges of the pages slightly curled with age. She sat down on the bed with it, curiosity nudging aside her usual caution. The first few pages were filled with photographs of the inn in its prime, guests gathered on the porch, children running across the lawn, holiday decorations strung above the doorway. Daniel appeared in several of them, much younger, standing beside a man and woman who could only be his parents. She turned the pages slowly, noting the easy smiles, the way everyone seemed to know one another. Then she turned a page, and her breath caught. There, in the center of the photograph, was Liam. It was unmistakably him, though the picture looked several years old. He stood next to Daniel, both of them dressed in casual clothes, their arms slung loosely over each other's shoulders, as if they'd known each other for a long time. Liam's smile was wide, the same easy grin he had worn the first time she'd met him, and Daniel looked younger, but recognizably himself. The background showed the front of the inn, the same rocking chairs still on the porch now. Grace stared at the image, her mind spinning. She traced Liam's outline with her fingertip, almost to convince herself it was real. There was no mistaking it. Daniel and Liam had known each other, and not just in passing. Her first thought was that it explained why Daniel hadn't seemed surprised to find her walking that day. Maybe he had recognized her immediately, even if she hadn't known him. But why hadn't he said anything? Why pretend not to know her connection to Liam? Questions began crowding in too quickly to sort. She turned another page, but the rest of the photos were of guests she didn't recognize. She closed the album slowly, her hands tightening around it. A knot formed in her stomach, the fragile calm she had felt here shifting under the weight of this new knowledge. She set the album back where she had found it, though the act felt strange, as if she were deliberately returning a secret to its hiding place. She stood and crossed to the window, staring out at the wet grass and the slow sway of the trees. Daniel was outside. She could see him through the thin curtain, carrying a basket from the garden toward the side of the building. He moved with the same steady rhythm he always did, as if there were no urgency to life, no need for sudden movements. Watching him, Grace wondered what else he was steady about, what he kept to himself without a flicker crossing his face. When she finally went downstairs, Daniel was in the kitchen washing vegetables at the sink. He glanced up and offered a small smile. "Morning," he said. "You slept late." She returned the smile, though it felt thin. "I guess I needed it." He nodded toward the table. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself." She poured a cup, the steam curling into the air, and sat while he worked. She wanted to ask about the photo immediately, to demand an explanation, but something in her hesitated. She didn't know what kind of answer she wanted, or if she was ready to hear it. Instead, she sipped her coffee and watched as he set the vegetables in a colander. They moved through the morning with a quiet routine. She offered to help prep food. He showed her where things were kept. They exchanged brief conversation about the weather and the state of the garden. But the image of Liam in that photo sat like a weight at the back of her mind. Every time Daniel spoke, she wondered if he was measuring his words, if he knew she had found it. Once or twice, she thought, she caught him glancing at her longer than necessary, as though he was wondering whether to say something. After lunch, Grace excused herself and went for a walk along the gravel drive. The air was crisp after the rain, and the leaves gave off a clean scent. She turned over possibilities in her mind. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Liam had once been a guest here, met Daniel in passing, and they'd taken a photo together. But the familiarity in their posture in that picture didn't feel like two strangers posing politely. They had looked like friends, or at least like men who had shared time together, which made it even stranger that Daniel had never mentioned it. She circled back to the inn and found Daniel on the porch, sanding one of the rocking chairs. He looked up as she approached. "Peaceful out there?" he asked. "Yes," she said, standing by the porch rail. For a moment, she almost asked him outright, but the words tangled at her throat. She told herself she would wait, watch, see if he brought it up himself. For now, she would keep what she had discovered to herself, at least until she decided whether she could trust whatever answer he gave. That night in her room, she pulled the drawer open again and took out the album. She studied the photo until her eyes blurred, memorizing every detail. The way Liam's arm rested easily around Daniel's shoulder, the faint squint in Daniel's eyes from the sun, the way the porch behind them looked exactly the same as it did now. She traced the edges of the page, then closed the album carefully and slid it back into place. Lying in bed afterward, she stared at the ceiling, her mind churning. The shelter she had found here no longer felt quite the same. Safety had been replaced with a thin thread of tension, one she couldn't yet name, but could feel pulling tighter. The next morning broke clear, the sky a pale blue brushed with thin streaks of cloud. Grace was already awake when the light began to fill her room, lying still and listening to the quiet hum of the inn around her. She hadn't slept well, her thoughts looping endlessly around the photograph she had found. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Liam standing next to Daniel, that easy grin on his face, his arm slung over Daniel's shoulder as though nothing in the world could come between them. She replayed Daniel's voice when he told her the place used to belong to his family, the calm way he had said it, as if there was nothing unusual about their paths crossing. It gnawed at her, not just the fact that they knew each other, but that he had never mentioned it. She wondered if he was waiting for her to bring it up, or if he was counting on her not to. When she finally rose, she dressed without much thought and went downstairs. Daniel was in the kitchen again, slicing fruit into a bowl. He looked up at her entrance, his usual nod of greeting in place. "Morning. Coffee's in the pot." She poured a cup and leaned against the counter, watching him. He moved with the same steady rhythm as always, his knife gliding through an orange with practiced ease. She sipped slowly, weighing her options. Part of her wanted to keep watching, keep holding the knowledge she had like a card she could play when she chose. But the longer she stayed silent, the more it felt like swallowing stones. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. He glanced up. "Yeah." She set the cup down. "I found a photo upstairs. In the dresser. It's of you and Liam. You look close." The knife paused mid-cut. For a moment he didn't move, his gaze dropping briefly to the cutting board before returning to her. "I was wondering when you'd see that," he said. The admission caught her off guard. "So, you weren't going to tell me?" He put the knife down and leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. "I thought about it, but you'd just been left standing in a chapel. I figured you didn't need more dropped on you right then." She felt heat rise in her chest, a mix of anger and confusion. More dropped on me? What exactly would have been dropped? He studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. "Liam and I worked together years ago. Not here, in the city. We were in the same line of business, you could say." "What business?" she pressed. His mouth tightened slightly. "Private security. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside." She frowned. "And from the inside?" He exhaled through his nose, almost like a laugh without humor. "From the inside, it was jobs for people who could afford to pay a lot to make problems disappear. Sometimes it was legitimate, protecting someone, retrieving stolen property. Sometimes it wasn't so clean." She let that sink in. The Liam she had known was charming, quick to laugh, quick to talk about his plans for the future. She had never imagined him in the shadows of anything dangerous. "So you're telling me Liam was, what? Some kind of mercenary?" Daniel shook his head. "Not exactly. But he had a habit of getting in over his head, taking jobs he shouldn't, making promises he couldn't keep." His gaze was steady on her now. "And when you're in that kind of work, breaking the wrong promise can be expensive." She felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the counter. "Expensive how?" "Not just money," he said quietly. "Reputation. Safety. The kind of people we worked for. You don't disappoint them without consequences." Her mind jumped to the note left under her door. "Don't look for him." The words now felt sharper, more dangerous. "So that's why he left me at the altar? To protect me from whoever?" Daniel's silence was its own kind of answer. "Do you know where he is?" she asked. His jaw worked, but he didn't speak right away. "If I did," he said finally, "it wouldn't be somewhere you could just walk into, and it wouldn't be somewhere I'd want you to follow." She felt a surge of frustration. "You're not answering me. You know more than you're saying. And you think knowing all of it will make you safer," he countered. The calm in his voice made it more infuriating. "You think you want answers, Grace, but answers have a way of pulling you deeper into things you can't walk back from." She stepped away from the counter, pacing to the other side of the kitchen. "You can stand there and tell me you worked with him, that you know the kind of people he was dealing with, and still expect me to just sit here and pretend it's none of my business?" "It stopped being just your business when he left you to keep you out of it," Daniel said, his voice firmer now. "You think that was about you? That was about him trying to keep a wall between what he was mixed up in and the life you had. I'm not going to be the one who tears that wall down." She turned to face him, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "You've already done that by telling me this much." They stood in silence, the only sound the faint tick of the clock above the pantry door. Finally, Daniel pushed away from the counter. "I'm not your enemy, Grace. I gave you a place to rest, not a trap. You're free to leave whenever you want. But if you stay, you have to trust that I'm doing what I can to keep you out of something ugly." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "And if I can't just sit and wait? If I decide I want to know anyway?" His eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "Then you'd better be ready for what comes with it." The rest of the day passed in an uneasy quiet. Grace went through the motions, helping chop vegetables for dinner, walking out to the edge of the property to watch the clouds shift in the afternoon light. But her mind was a restless tide. She replayed the conversation again and again, each time catching on the pieces he hadn't said. Daniel knew more about Liam's disappearance than he was willing to tell. And whatever he knew, it wasn't something harmless. That much was clear. By evening, the air had cooled and a low wind rustled the trees. They ate in the sitting room, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Daniel didn't bring up their conversation again, and neither did she. But when she glanced at him over her cup, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, somewhere between caution and concern. She wondered if he was weighing how long she'd stay, or if he was already thinking about what he'd do if she decided to go looking for Liam herself. When she went up to her room that night, She closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the quilt-covered bed. She knew she should rest, should let the day go. But instead she crossed to the dresser and pulled out the photo album again. She studied Liam's face, Daniel's face, the porch behind them, until the lines of the image began to blur. She thought about the wall Daniel had mentioned, the one Liam had supposedly built to keep her safe. And she thought about how walls could be climbed if you were willing to risk the fall. Grace didn't fall asleep easily that night. The photo album lay where she had left it on the dresser, its worn leather spine turned toward her like an unblinking eye. She tried to read, tried to distract herself with the low murmur of rain on the roof, but every time she set the book down, her mind would return to Daniel's voice in the kitchen earlier, calm but sharp with boundaries. "I'm doing what I can to keep you out of something ugly." It was the same tone Liam had used once or twice when she'd asked about parts of his work he didn't want to discuss. Back then, she'd taken it as him protecting her. Now she wasn't so sure it wasn't about keeping her in the dark for his own reasons. When she finally drifted into sleep, it was shallow, punctuated by restless turns. She dreamt of walking down the aisle in the chapel again. Only the pews were empty and Daniel stood at the altar instead of Liam, saying nothing, just watching her with that same unreadable expression. She woke before dawn, heart pounding. The air in the room was cool, and faint light bled into the sky outside. There was no point trying to sleep again. She dressed quietly, pulling on the sweater she'd worn the day she arrived, and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her feet in the stillness. Downstairs, she found the kitchen empty, but for the faint aroma of coffee brewing. She poured herself a cup, the warmth soothing against her hands. Outside, the yard was wrapped in mist. The shapes of the rocking chairs on the porch softened at the edges. She stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath her slippers, and leaned against the railing. Somewhere deep in the trees a bird called, its note carrying through the damp air. For a few minutes, she let herself just stand there, sipping coffee, feeling almost like part of the quiet. The sound of a door closing behind her broke that illusion. She turned to see Daniel step out, his jacket unzipped, his hair slightly damp as if he'd just washed his face. He carried a mug in one hand and eyed her with mild surprise. "You're up early." She shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded once and joined her at the railing, leaning on his forearms. They stood in silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee and watching the mist begin to lift. It was Grace who broke the quiet. "You said yesterday you were keeping me out of something ugly." She kept her eyes on the yard. "I need to know what that means, Daniel. Not hints. Not warnings. The truth." He didn't answer immediately. She glanced at him and saw the muscle in his jaw working, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the trees. "You really want to know?" he said finally. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Then you'd better sit down," he said. They moved to the rocking chairs. Daniel rested his mug on the arm of his chair, his hands loose in his lap. For a long moment he just stared at the boards beneath their feet. After Liam disappeared from the chapel, he began. "I already knew where he'd gone. Not exactly the street address, but the circle he was in. We'd both been out of that work for a while, or at least I thought we had. But a few months back, I heard his name again from people I still had contacts with, and not in a good way. He'd taken a job for someone I won't name. It went bad. He owed them money, or maybe he owed them something else. Either way, they weren't the type to just let it slide." Grace felt her pulse in her throat. "So he ran." "He ran," Daniel agreed. "And in running, he left you exposed. You didn't know the details, but you were in his life. That made you a loose end to the people he crossed." She gripped the arms of her chair. "You're saying someone might come after me because of him?" "I'm saying they'd at least look in your direction," Daniel said, his tone low. "And some of them don't mind using pressure to get what they want. Pressure like a fiancé who doesn't know where he's hiding." She swallowed hard. "So the note, 'Don't look for him,' that was from them?" "Most likely," he said. "Or from someone trying to keep you from making yourself visible to them." "And which one are you?" she asked, the question sharp. His gaze flicked to hers. "I'm the one who's been making sure you stayed off their radar." "By following me? By picking me up on the road, like you just happened to be there?" I was there because I'd been keeping tabs since he left, Daniel said evenly. You walking alone in a wedding dress down a back road wasn't hard to spot. The admission landed like a stone in her chest. So you've been watching me. Not watching to control you, he said. Watching to make sure no one else did. There's a difference. She shook her head slowly, trying to process it. And if I hadn't found that photo, would you have ever told me you knew him? I don't know, he said after a beat. Maybe not. The less you knew, the easier it would be for you to move on. Grace leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking. You've been making decisions for me without asking. That's not protecting Daniel. That's deciding I don't get to choose. His eyes softened slightly, though his voice stayed steady. Sometimes choosing without knowing the stakes is just walking into a trap. I didn't want that for you. And what do you want from me? She asked. For you to be safe. Whether that means staying here until this blows over or walking away from all of it. The words hung between them, and Grace felt an ache rise in her chest. And if I decide I want to find him anyway, she asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then I'd have to decide whether to help you or to try to stop you. And I don't like either of those options. So you'd stop me? If I thought it would save your life, yes, he said. They sat in silence after that, the mist almost gone now, the yard sharp in the morning light. Grace's thoughts were a tangle, gratitude for what he'd done, anger at his secrecy, fear for what might still come. She realized with a kind of cold clarity that if what he said was true, Liam hadn't just left her. He'd left her with his enemies. That note hadn't been a threat so much as a warning shot. As the morning wore on, the conversation shifted to quieter things, the weather, the repairs Daniel planned for the porch, but the tension remained, coiled and waiting. Grace helped him with small chores, her hands busy but her mind far away. Every time she looked at him, she saw both the man who had given her shelter and the man who had kept her in the dark. That night, after dinner, she lingered in the sitting room while Daniel washed up. The fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly in the grate. She turned the note over in her hands. She'd been carrying it in her pocket all day, without thinking. When Daniel came in, drying his hands, she held it up. If they come, she said quietly, what will you do? He didn't answer right away, just stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. Whatever I have to, he said finally. And if that means standing between you and them, then that's what I'll do. It should have been reassuring. Instead, Grace felt the weight of it settle on her like a shadow. Standing between her and them might mean drawing their attention more sharply. It might mean Daniel putting himself in danger for someone he claimed to be protecting out of obligation. She wasn't sure yet whether to believe it was only obligation. But as she watched him, the set of his shoulders, the way he didn't look away, she knew one thing. The decision of whether to leave or stay was no longer one she could avoid much longer. Grace woke the next morning to the faint sound of voices. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, the low tones drifting up the stairs like background noise from a half-remembered conversation. But as she sat up, the weight of the quilt pooling around her waist, she realized the sound was real. She slipped out of bed and padded to the door, opening it just enough to listen. Daniel's voice was one of them, calm, measured, but the other voice was unfamiliar, sharper at the edges. She couldn't make out all the words, but the tone alone made her stomach knot. She moved down the hallway quietly, stopping at the top of the stairs, where she could hear better. No, she doesn't know everything, Daniel was saying. That's the point. Less she knows, the less they can pull from her. The other man's reply was too low to catch, but whatever it was made Daniel's voice tighten. I said I'd handle it. That hasn't changed. Silence followed, then the sound of a door closing. Grace moved back quickly, slipping into her room and sitting on the bed as she heard footsteps in the hallway. A moment later there was a knock. It's me, Daniel's voice came. She swallowed, trying to make her tone steady. Come in. He stepped inside, his jacket on like he'd just been outside. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. I have to go into town for a couple of hours. You'll be safe here. She nodded slowly. Who was that? His gaze flickered, and for a second she thought he might tell her. But then he said simply, a friend. Someone who helps me keep track of things. It wasn't enough, but she didn't press. After he left, the quiet in the inn felt different. Not peaceful this time, but heavy. Grace wandered from room to room, restless. In the sitting room, she found herself staring at the cold fireplace, wondering how many conversations had been had here over the years, how many truths had been told, and how many buried. The thought of leaving had been hovering at the back of her mind for days, but now it pressed forward, demanding attention. Leaving meant safety, maybe. It meant distance from Daniel's secrets, from Liam's unfinished mess. But it also meant stepping back into a world where she had no plan, no anchor. The idea of walking away felt like tearing something loose from herself, something that had grown despite the circumstances. She went to her room and began packing slowly, folding clothes into her suitcase. The motion was automatic, but her chest felt tight with each item she placed inside. She imagined herself walking out to the road, flagging down a bus, disappearing into a larger town where no one knew her. She could take a temporary job, rent a small room, start over. But with each imagined step, she couldn't shake the thought of the people Daniel had warned her about, the ones who might still see her as a thread to pull. Being alone might not be safer. It might just make her an easier target. By the time Daniel returned, the suitcase was half-packed, sitting open on the bed. He stopped in the doorway, taking it in with one glance. "So that's the choice you're leaning toward." His voice was quiet, not accusing. She looked at him, searching for any sign of relief or disappointment. "I don't know if staying here is helping me, Daniel. And I don't know if leaving will help either. But I can't keep sitting still." He stepped into the room, leaning against the dresser. "You're not wrong. But if you walk out that door without a plan, you'll be making yourself visible in ways you don't understand yet." She frowned. "And if I stay? If you stay, I can control what comes near you. I can see it before it hits." His tone was steady, but his eyes told a different story. There was tension there, like he was bracing for her to say the opposite. "And what happens if they decide you're in the way?" she asked. He didn't look away. "Then I deal with that too." They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "You've been making choices for me since the moment you picked me up on that road. If I stay, it's because I choose it this time, not because you've boxed me in." "Understood," he said. The rest of the day passed in a kind of suspended state. Grace didn't unpack her suitcase, but she didn't finish packing either. She helped Daniel repair a loose step on the porch, her hand steadying the board as he drove in nails. They worked without much conversation, but the silence felt different. Less like avoidance, more like waiting. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the air turned cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the trees. That night, they sat in the kitchen after dinner, the light warm against the dark windows. Daniel poured them each a small glass of whiskey from a bottle he'd kept tucked away. "Whatever you decide," he said, sliding her glass across the table. "I'll respect it, but I need you to understand. If you stay, you'll be stepping into my world. And if you go, I can't follow you everywhere." She studied him over the rim of her glass. "And if I step into your world, what does that look like?" "It looks like being careful where you go, who you talk to. It looks like trusting me when I say no to certain things, even if you don't understand why at the moment. It looks like staying close when I tell you to. And it means you'll hear things about Liam you may wish you hadn't." She thought about Liam's laugh, the way he used to touch her shoulder lightly when passing behind her, the promises he'd made about a life they would build. And she thought about the photo, the note, the quiet in Daniel's voice when he'd said Liam was trying to keep a wall between them. "Do you think he's still alive?" she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes, but alive isn't the same as safe." When she went to bed, the decision was still unsettled. Sleep came slowly, broken by brief, vivid dreams of being in the chapel again, this time with neither Liam nor Daniel waiting at the altar, just an empty space, and the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She woke in the dark, her heart racing. The quiet of the inn felt absolute, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound louder. She sat up, listening. Somewhere downstairs, a floorboard creaked. She moved to the door and opened it a crack, peering into the hallway. Another faint creak, then a soft thud, like something being set down. She slipped on her shoes and padded to the stairs, her hand light on the banister. From the landing, she saw Daniel in the foyer, locking the front door. He turned, saw her, and paused. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Neither could you, apparently." He gave a small shrug. "Just making sure everything's shut. It's easier to rest that way." They ended up sitting in the sitting room. The fire revived to a low crackle. Grace wrapped the quilt from the couch around her shoulders. "I've made my choice," she said quietly. Daniel's gaze lifted to hers, waiting. "I'm staying. But not because I'm afraid to leave, because I want to see this through. I want to know the truth about Liam, and about why all of this happened." For the first time since she'd met him, something like relief softened his features. "Then we'll face it together," he said. They sat there a while longer, the firelight throwing shifting patterns on the walls. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, but inside the choice had been made. Grace knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, and danger might still find them. But for the first time since the chapel, she felt the ground solid under her feet. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be standing alone. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like, comment, and share. Also turn on the bell to get more of our videos. See you in the next story.